My name is Edith Green, and I am 32 years old. Until recently, I believed I was standing on the edge of a life I had carefully built with the man I planned to marry. We had been together for 4 years, engaged since last September, with a wedding date set for June. On paper, everything looked solid: shared routines, mutual friends, a future that seemed decided. But beneath that surface, something had begun to erode quietly, the way water wears away stone, long before the cracks are visible. About 2 months before everything unraveled, Paul started to feel distant in ways that were subtle enough to excuse, but persistent enough to unsettle me. His phone was always face down. He started working late, even though his job had never demanded it before. Conversations that once flowed easily turned clipped and functional. When I reached for him in bed, he sighed, not angrily, but with the weary impatience of someone who felt interrupted. I didn't think he was cheating. I told myself that relationships go through phases, that stress can make people withdraw, that love sometimes requires patience instead of panic. I wanted to believe that what we were experiencing was temporary and fixable. That was why I suggested couples therapy, not as an accusation and not because I thought our relationship was broken beyond repair, but because communication had started to feel strained and brittle. I believed that bringing in a professional might help us reset before resentment hardened into something permanent. Paul agreed, though his agreement felt hollow, like something he offered to avoid a longer conversation rather than because he believed in it. We found a therapist with availability on Thursday evenings. The sessions were expensive, $175 each, and since I earned more, I paid without hesitation. I treated it as an investment in our future, something worth protecting. The first session was easy enough, mostly introductions and surface-level discussions about how we met and what we loved about each other. The second session went deeper, and that was when the therapist gently noted how Paul tended to deflect when asked directly about his feelings. He joked, generalized, and redirected, never quite answering the question he'd been asked. I noticed it too, but I still wanted to believe it didn't mean what it felt like it meant. The third session was scheduled for 6 o'clock on a Thursday evening, and I arrived early. I left work ahead of schedule, grabbed a coffee, and sat in the waiting room at 5:50, scrolling on my phone and rehearsing what I wanted to say. At exactly 6 o'clock, Paul wasn't there. I texted him to check in, asking if he was on his way. 5 minutes later, he replied that he was running a little late and told me to start without him. It felt odd, but not alarming enough to make a scene. The therapist called me in, and I explained that Paul would be joining us shortly. She nodded and suggested we begin with some individual reflection while we waited. By 6:15, he still hadn't arrived. I texted again, asking if everything was okay. His response came quickly, and when I read it, my stomach tightened. In a way I couldn't immediately explain. He said he was grabbing drinks with an old friend and had lost track of time, but that he would be there soon. I stared at my phone, read the message again, and then handed it to the therapist without saying anything at first. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded steadier than I felt. I told her that he was getting drinks during our scheduled therapy session, one that he had known about for 2 weeks. The therapist maintained her composure, but I could see the calculation behind her neutral expression. She asked how that made me feel, and the answer came out more honestly than I expected. I told her it made me feel like I wasn't a priority, and as soon as I said it, something inside me clicked into place. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern I had been smoothing over for months. The canceled dinner plans because someone else needed him more. The birthday party he showed up late to without apology. The vacation discussions he kept postponing while still finding time for spontaneous outings with other people. For the next 45 minutes, the therapist and I talked about patterns, boundaries, and what I wanted from a partnership versus what I was actually receiving. She called it a productive individual session, but to me, it felt like a quiet reckoning. At 6:58, 2 minutes before the session was scheduled to end, the door opened. Paul walked in looking flushed, smelling faintly of wine, and wearing an expression of casual confusion, as if he'd wandered into the wrong room. He apologized lightly and asked if he had missed much. I looked at him and told him the session was over. He laughed and pointed out that it didn't end until 7, brushing it off as if time were flexible when it came to things that mattered to me. When he called it not a big deal, something settled uncomfortably in my chest, heavy and unmistakable. It wasn't that he was late. It was that he didn't care that he was late. And in that moment, sitting in that quiet office with a therapist who had just watched everything I'd been excusing laid bare, I realized that the empty chair at the start of the session hadn't been the real problem. The problem was that emotionally, that chair had been empty for a long time. We left the therapist's office separately, which hadn't been the plan but suddenly felt inevitable. Paul said he needed to grab his car from a different lot, a small logistical excuse that mirrored so many others he had used lately, and I didn't argue. The silence between us in the hallway felt heavier than any confrontation could have. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking not from anger, but from the slow, dawning realization that something I had been trying to save might already be beyond repair. I drove home replaying the session in my head, not his lateness, but the way the therapist had listened, the way she hadn't rushed to soothe or justify, the way she had let the truth sit in the room without softening it. When Paul arrived later that evening, he acted as if nothing significant had happened. He kicked off his shoes, asked if I was hungry, and commented on traffic with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. The normalcy felt surreal, like watching someone continue a performance after the audience had already left. I responded politely, but minimally, giving him nothing to push against. I could see the irritation building behind his eyes, the discomfort of not being reassured that everything was fine. Around 10 o'clock, he finally snapped and asked if I was seriously still upset about him being late, framing it as a single minor misstep that I was dragging out unnecessarily. That was the moment I said it out loud. The sentence that had been forming since I sat alone in the waiting room earlier that evening. I told him I was reconsidering the engagement. The words didn't come with drama or raised voices. They landed flat and heavy between us. Paul stared at me as if I'd spoken in another language, then demanded to know how I could even think about throwing away 4 years over something so small. I tried to explain that it wasn't one incident, that it was a pattern of choices that consistently placed me last. But he heard accusation where I was offering clarity. He called me controlling, said I was looking for problems where none existed, and accused me of blowing things out of proportion because a stranger in a therapist's office had gotten into my head. I didn't argue back the way I might have months earlier. Instead, I told him I needed time to think time without being pressured, to minimize my own feelings for the sake of keeping the peace. That night, I slept in the guest room, staring at the ceiling and wondering how long I had been slowly adjusting myself to fit into the space he was willing to give me. In the morning, he left for work without saying goodbye, a quiet confirmation of how easily avoidance had become his default response. I spent the day in a fog, going through the practical realities of our shared life with an unexpected sense of calm. We didn't share bank accounts, something I had once considered a lack of commitment, but now felt grateful for. The apartment lease was in my name, signed before he moved in. The engagement ring had been my grandmother's passed down, with the expectation that it would return to the family if things didn't work out. Each fact grounded me further, stripping away the panic and replacing it with something steadier, something closer to resolve. By the time Paul texted that evening, asking if we could talk, I knew the conversation wouldn't be about convincing me to stay so much as about whether he was willing to finally tell the truth. When he came home, he brought takeout from my favorite Thai place, a peace offering that felt rehearsed. He launched into an apology that sounded practiced, admitting he'd been uncomfortable with therapy because it made the relationship feel broken and confessing that avoiding the session had seemed easier than facing our problems. I listened without interrupting, waiting for the part where honesty went deeper than explanation. When I asked who the friend was, the air in the room changed immediately. Paul blinked, stalled, and then deflected, asking why it mattered and accusing me of interrogating him instead of accepting his apology. I repeated the question calmly, explaining that he had chosen this person over our therapy session and that I deserved to know who that was. His refusal to answer told me more than any name could have. The defensiveness, the shifting focus, the insistence that I was being unreasonable, all followed the same familiar script, and for the first time I didn't play my part in it. I stood up and told him I thought we should take a break. The word hit him harder than I expected, and he reacted with disbelief, then anger, then tears that felt more like frustration than remorse. He left in a rush, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frames on the wall, and texted minutes later to say he was staying with his sister. I didn't respond. That night, I sat on the couch making quiet lists in my head, separating what was mine from what was his, and realizing that clarity, once it arrives, is impossible to unsee. The apartment was unnervingly quiet the next morning, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel amplified. I went through my routine on autopilot, making coffee, checking emails, getting dressed for work, all while my mind circled the same unanswered question. It wasn't about jealousy or suspicion in the way Paul wanted to frame it. It was about honesty. Someone who had nothing to hide wouldn't treat a name like a state secret. That thought followed me throughout the day, settling deeper with every hour that passed without a message from him. When Paul finally reached out, it wasn't with an explanation, but with a request. He asked if we could talk that evening face to face, and I agreed more out of a desire for closure than hope. I didn't want to spend another night filling in the blanks on my own. When he arrived, he looked tired, not devastated, but worn down in the way someone gets when they're forced to defend a version of events that doesn't quite hold together. He took a deep breath and launched into what was clearly a prepared speech, admitting again that skipping therapy had been a mistake, and insisting that it had nothing to do with caring less about me. He told me he loved me, that he wanted to marry me, and that he was asking for another chance. I listened carefully, waiting for the moment where accountability replaced performance. When I asked again who he had been drinking with, his composure cracked. He stalled, asked why I was fixating on something so unimportant, and accused me of turning an apology into an interrogation. I told him calmly that the question mattered because he had lied about where he was, and because he had chosen that person over our commitment to therapy. The refusal that followed wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet and firm, which somehow made it worse. He said the name wasn't relevant, and that what mattered was that he was there now, trying to fix things. That answer shifted something in me permanently. It told me that even now, even after everything that had happened, he was still more invested in controlling the narrative than in telling the truth. I told him I needed space to decide what I wanted, not because he was late once, but because he couldn't give me a straight answer about something that directly affected my trust in him. He reacted with disbelief, then anger, framing my need for space as an overreaction fueled by paranoia. He accused me of throwing away 4 years over someone from his past, even as he continued to insist that person didn't matter enough to name. When he left, slamming the door behind him, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. The chaos he brought with him seemed to exit the room at the same time, leaving behind a clarity that felt both painful and grounding. Over the next 2 days, the silence stretched on, broken only by practical thoughts that began to organize themselves without effort. I mentally cataloged our belongings, noting which pieces of furniture I had owned before he moved in, and which things we had bought together. The process wasn't about punishment or control. It was about preparing myself for the possibility that this really was the end. On Sunday afternoon, Paul's sister showed up unannounced. I had always gotten along with her well enough, but that day she didn't bother with pleasantries. She demanded to know what was wrong with me, accusing me of devastating her brother over a single mistake. I listened quietly and then asked her what he had told her that mistake was. When she said he'd claimed he was simply late to therapy, I corrected her gently, explaining that he had skipped the session to get drinks with someone he refused to identify. The shift in her expression was subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of doubt that told me she hadn't been given the full story. She left not long after, less confrontational than when she arrived, and I knew I had planted a seed whether she wanted to acknowledge it or not. The following morning, Paul texted again, asking if he could come over that evening because he owed me an explanation. I agreed, not because I expected reconciliation, but because I needed to hear the truth from his own mouth. Whatever was coming, I was ready to face it, even if it confirmed what I already suspected. Paul arrived right on time that evening, which would have felt meaningful if punctuality hadn't already been stripped of its symbolism. He stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in as if he were bracing himself for impact, and I noticed immediately that he hadn't brought food flowers or any small offering to soften the conversation. This wasn't going to be an apology disguised as comfort. It was going to be a confession, or at least the closest version of one he was willing to give. He sat across from me and told me he owed me honesty. The phrasing struck me as careful, almost legalistic, and I waited without interrupting as he explained that the person he had gone for drinks with wasn't just an old friend, but a woman he had briefly dated in college. He was quick to minimize it, emphasizing that it had been only a few dates, and that it hadn't been serious, that they hadn't spoken in years, and that nothing had happened between them that night. As he spoke, I felt a strange detachment settle over me, as though I were watching the scene from outside my own body, listening not just to his words, but to what he was still avoiding. I repeated his explanation back to him slowly, letting the reality of it fill the room. He had skipped our therapy session to get drinks with someone he had once been involved with, then lied about who she was and where he was, and continued to withhold the truth even when confronted directly. When I said it that way, he flinched and told me I was framing it unfairly. That context mattered, that it sounded worse than it was. I asked him why, if it was so insignificant, he hadn't just told me the truth from the beginning. His answer was the same one I had heard in different forms for weeks. He knew I would overreact. That explanation landed like a quiet insult. It wasn't just that he had lied, it was that he believed I couldn't be trusted with the truth, that managing my reaction mattered more than respecting my right to make informed choices about my own relationship. We went in circles for over an hour, him apologizing for the outcome while defending the decision that caused it, me trying to explain that accountability meant more than regret after the fact. At some point, I realized that the conversation wasn't moving toward resolution, only repetition. That was when I asked for the engagement ring back. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. He stared at me in disbelief, then accused me of being cold, of punishing him instead of working through the issue like adults. I reminded him that the ring had belonged to my grandmother, that it wasn't just a symbol of our future, but of my family's trust, and that trust had been damaged. He didn't argue with that, at least not directly. Instead, he stood up, said he needed time to think, and walked out wearing the ring, as if delaying the inevitable might somehow change its meaning. After he left, I sat alone in the quiet apartment and felt the weight of what I had just done settle in fully. I wasn't angry anymore. I was sad, deeply and achingly sad. But beneath that sadness was a sense of relief I hadn't expected. For the first time since things started to go wrong, I wasn't making excuses for him or softening the truth for my own comfort. I was simply acknowledging what was in front of me, even if it hurt. The next morning, my phone was full of missed calls and messages from people who weren't him. His mother left a voicemail accusing me of destroying her son's life over a misunderstanding. A mutual friend texted to ask if I was really willing to throw everything away over one mistake. I deleted the voicemail and didn't respond to the messages. I knew now that this wasn't about a single choice, but about a pattern of behavior that had finally been dragged into the light. I went to bed that night knowing the ring was still with him, but also knowing that whatever happened next, the engagement as I had understood it was already over. 10 days passed without a word from Paul, a silence so complete it felt deliberate. No texts, no calls, no late-night apologies, typed and deleted. At first I told myself he was thinking, processing, maybe even taking responsibility in his own way. But as the days stretched on, it became clear that the silence itself was a choice. I went to work, came home, and settled into a version of life that felt unfamiliar, but strangely steadier, as if my nervous system were finally getting a break from constant vigilance. I stopped checking my phone every few minutes and started noticing how peaceful the apartment felt when I wasn't waiting for the next explanation that never quite explained anything. That illusion shattered on a Thursday evening when I pulled into the parking lot and saw Paul's car parked in his old spot. For a moment, I just sat there with the engine running, staring through the windshield as if the car might disappear if I didn't acknowledge it. He still had a key, something I had meant to address, but hadn't found the emotional energy for yet. By the time I unlocked the door and stepped inside, my guard was already up, every instinct alert. Paul was sitting on the couch and he wasn't alone. There was a woman beside him. Someone I had never seen before perched stiffly at the edge of the cushion, like she was ready to stand at any moment. Paul jumped to his feet when he saw me. His movements rushed and uncoordinated and introduced her with a confidence that didn't quite reach his eyes. He said she was there to clear things up, to explain, to prove that nothing inappropriate had happened. Before I could respond, the woman stood as well and spoke, her voice careful and rehearsed, telling me she was the person he had gotten drinks with and that she wanted me to know it had been innocent. The audacity of the scene almost made me laugh. They had decided, without my consent or warning, to stage an ambush in my own apartment, as if presenting a witness would somehow override weeks of lies and deflection. As she spoke, she insisted that nothing physical had happened, that they had only talked about old times, that she hadn't even known he was engaged until he mentioned it casually at the bar. That was when I noticed her eyes flick toward his hand, or rather to where the ring should have been. He wasn't wearing it. When I pointed that out, he muttered something about his fingers swelling. Sometimes a weak explanation that collapsed under its own weight the moment it was spoken. I asked the question that had been echoing in my mind since the therapy session, asking why. If everything had been so innocent, he had lied about who she was and where he was. He repeated the familiar line, saying he knew I would overreact, that he was trying to avoid drama, that bringing her here was meant to show transparency. Transparency, I told him, doesn't arrive unannounced with an audience. Transparency starts with the truth offered freely, not dragged out under pressure. The woman shifted uncomfortably and eventually excused herself, clearly realizing she had stepped into something far messier than she had been led to believe. After she left, Paul turned on me with a mix of frustration and wounded pride, accusing me of refusing to accept proof of making it impossible for him to do anything right. I reminded him that the problem wasn't that he had gotten drinks with someone from his past, but that he had lied about it repeatedly and then tried to control the fallout instead of owning it. That was when he reached for the ring. He yanked it off his finger and threw it at me hard enough that I barely had time to react before instinct kicked in and I caught it midair. The weight of it in my palm felt heavier than it ever had when I wore it less like jewelry and more like a final punctuation mark. He told me we were done, that he couldn't be with someone who didn't trust him, and I told him calmly and without raising my voice that I couldn't be with someone who believed trust meant accepting lies. He stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook, and I stood there alone in the aftermath ring, clenched in my hand, heart racing, but mind strangely clear. That night, I changed the locks, boxed up the rest of his belongings, and set them aside to be picked up by his sister. When the apartment finally went quiet again, it felt different this time, not hollow, but settled like a storm that had finally passed. The days after Paul left unfolded with an efficiency that surprised me. I changed the locks first, not out of spite, but out of necessity, because boundaries mean nothing if they aren't enforced. I boxed up what remained of his things and coordinated a brief, emotionless handoff through his sister, who showed up quieter than before, her earlier certainty replaced by something closer to resignation. I didn't ask what she now believed, and she didn't offer it. When she left, the apartment felt fully mine again, for the first time in months, not just legally, but emotionally, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. The fallout came in waves. Paul's mother called and left a voicemail so sharp, it felt rehearsed, accusing me of destroying her son's life over a misunderstanding and warning me that I would regret being so unforgiving. I deleted it without listening twice. A mutual friend texted then, another each message carrying some version of the same question was, "I really willing to end an engagement over drinks with an ex-girlfriend?" I stopped replying altogether once I realized how easily the narrative shifted when details were selectively removed. Explaining myself felt pointless when the people asking weren't actually listening. What I didn't expect was the call from the therapist. She said she didn't usually reach out outside of scheduled sessions, but given how abruptly things had ended, she wanted to check in. I gave her the short version, leaving out the theatrics and focusing on the pattern that had finally become impossible to ignore. She listened and then said something that settled into me slowly, like a truth that had been waiting for permission to land. She told me the session had been productive because I had been ready to see what was already there, and that many people never reach that point. She offered a few individual sessions if I wanted them not to fix something broken, but to understand why I had stayed as long as I did. I agreed, realizing that clarity doesn't end with leaving. Sometimes it only begins there. In the sessions that followed, we talked about my own patterns, not just Paul's, why I had interpreted inconsistency as stress, why I had treated my time as flexible while guarding everyone else's, why I had mistaken endurance for loyalty. It wasn't comfortable work, but it was honest, and honesty. I was learning feels different when it isn't weaponized against you. I started sleeping better. I stopped replaying conversations in my head. The anxiety that had once lived just beneath my skin began to loosen its grip. I heard through mutual friends that Paul had started telling people I was controlling, emotionally cold, that I had overreacted and refused to hear his side. The story was predictable, and oddly enough, it didn't hurt the way I thought it would. The people who knew me well didn't buy it, and the ones who did were never really in my corner to begin with. His sister sent one final text apologizing for showing up unannounced weeks earlier and admitting that when she pressed him about the pattern I described, he became defensive instead of reflective. I didn't respond, but I appreciated the acknowledgement. The ring went back to my family where it belonged. My mother admitted carefully and without judgment that she had worried about Paul for a long time but hadn't wanted to interfere. She told me I had always been explaining him away, and hearing it framed that way felt like someone turning on a light in a room I had been navigating in the dark. I donated what reminded me of him, kept what was practical, and rearranged the furniture so the apartment no longer looked like a shared life paused mid-scene. I'm not dating. I'm not rushing to replace what I lost because what I lost wasn't stability or safety, but the illusion of it. What I gained was something quieter and far more durable, the certainty that wanting honesty, consistency, and effort isn't asking for too much. It's asking for the bare minimum. The night everything fell apart, I sat alone in a therapist's office and admitted a truth I had been avoiding for months. The relationship had already ended. Paul just hadn't bothered to say it out loud. His absence that evening wasn't the end. It was the symptom. Now, when I sit on my couch in the evenings, the silence doesn't feel like loss. It feels like space. And space, I've learned, is where clarity finally has room to breathe. 3 weeks passed without anything dramatic happening, and for the first time since all of this began, that felt like a gift instead of a threat. No surprise visits, no emotional texts disguised as closure, no new versions of the story delivered through other people. The apartment settled into a rhythm that was entirely mine. I deep cleaned every room, not in a frantic erase the past kind of way, but methodically opening windows, donating what no longer felt like it belonged to my life, and keeping what was practical without attaching meaning to it. The couch stayed because replacing it would have been expensive, not because it held memories worth preserving, and that distinction mattered more than I expected. Work kept me busy, which helped. Routine has a way of anchoring you when your personal life feels like it's been rearranged overnight. Friends checked in. Some cautiously, others with relief, admitting they'd sensed something was off for a while, but hadn't known how to say it. I appreciated the honesty, even when it stung a little, because it confirmed what therapy had already started to uncover. I hadn't been imagining things. I had been adapting to them. The individual sessions with the therapist continued, and they were different from anything I'd expected. We didn't spend much time dissecting Paul's behavior anymore. Instead, we focused on why I stayed, why I rationalized inconsistency, why I treated discomfort as something to push through instead of information to listen to. She pointed out gently but firmly that I had been negotiating for basic consideration in a relationship that required me to keep lowering the bar to avoid conflict. Naming that didn't make me feel foolish. It made me feel awake. I did hear more about the narrative Paul was spreading, how I had supposedly blindsided him, how I was emotionally rigid and controlling, how therapy had turned me against him. A few people believed it, at least at first, but most didn't. The ones who knew me understood that I don't make impulsive decisions lightly, and that I had given more chances than I should have. The gossip lost its power quickly once I stopped trying to counter it. Silence, I learned, can be a boundary too. One afternoon, I received a final message from Paul's sister. She said she had talked to him again, asked about the pattern I'd described, and watched him deflect instead of reflect. She apologized for how she had confronted me weeks earlier and said I hadn't deserved any of it. I didn't respond, but I let the message sit there without resentment. Not everything needs a reply to be acknowledged. The ring remained with my family safe and unspoken. My mother admitted quietly that she had always felt something was off, that she had watched me make excuses, and hoped I would see things clearly on my own. Hearing that didn't make me angry. It made me feel supported in a way I hadn't realized I needed. Sometimes the people closest to you wait, not because they don't care, but because they trust you to arrive at the truth in your own time. I'm not ready to date, and I'm not in a hurry to be. For 4 years, I adjusted myself around someone else's absence, convincing myself that patience was the same thing as love. Now the absence is gone, and what remains is space quiet and a sense of relief that still surprises me when I notice it. I no longer feel like an option in my own life. I feel present. The Thursday evening, when everything unraveled, wasn't the end of my relationship. It was the moment I finally stopped pretending it hadn't already ended. Paul skipping therapy wasn't the betrayal that broke us. It was the clearest symptom of a pattern that had been unfolding slowly and visibly every time he chose something else over showing up for us. I'm grateful I saw it when I did, even if it took an empty chair and a solo therapy session to force my hand. If there's one thing I know now, it's this. When you consistently feel like an afterthought in a relationship, that feeling is telling you the truth. And listening to it isn't selfish, it's survival.